Elena Martinez was 28 years old when she discovered that love could be conditional, even from those who gave her life. Her parents chose golden silk over her golden chances of survival, prioritizing her sister's perfect wedding day over their daughter's beaten heart. While champagne glasses clinked in celebration 2 states away, Elena lay in a hospital bed, her surgery postponed indefinitely because the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally had emptied their savings account for floral arrangements instead of her medical bills. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But Elena wasn't just anyone's wife. She was married to Governor James Richardson of Colorado, a man who understood that justice wasn't always served in courtrooms, but sometimes in the quiet halls of power where decisions echo through generations. What her parents didn't realize was that their choice to abandon their daughter would cost them everything they thought they were protecting. Because when you hurt the woman a governor loves, you don't just face personal consequences, you face the full weight of institutional accountability. The question that haunted Elena through those dark hospital nights wasn't whether she would survive her condition. It was whether she could survive the realization that her family's love had terms and conditions attached. Tell us in the comments, have you ever discovered that the people closest to you valued appearances more than your life? Because what Elena learned next would reshape not just her understanding of family, but the entire landscape of medical rights in her state. The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of Elena's bedroom in the governor's mansion, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that gleamed like amber. She'd been awake since 4, her hand pressed against her chest, feeling the irregular rhythm that had become her unwelcome companion over the past 6 months. Each flutter felt like a butterfly trapped behind her ribs, desperate to escape. The irony wasn't lost on her that the heart which had always been too generous, too trusting, was now the very thing betraying her body. Dr. Sarah Hendricks had been gentle but direct during that appointment 3 weeks ago. Elena remembered every word, every pause, every concerned glance the cardiologist had shared with James across the sterile examination room. The mitral valve wasn't just damaged, it was deteriorating rapidly. Without surgical intervention within the next month, Elena's heart would begin to fail in ways that no amount of medication could reverse. The surgery itself was complex, but routine, Dr. Hendricks had assured them. The real challenge wasn't medical, it was financial. Even with James' government insurance, the specialized procedure would require a significant out-of-pocket contribution. The specific surgeon Elena needed, Dr. Michael Torres at Denver Presbyterian, was out of network, but considered the best in the region for her particular condition. The cost would be substantial, $47,000 that needed to be available up front before the hospital would schedule the operation. James had immediately begun liquidating investments and exploring every avenue, but as a public servant, his liquid assets were limited by design, a deliberate choice they had made early in their marriage to avoid any appearance of impropriety. That's when Elena had made the call that would change everything. She had dialed her parents' number on a Tuesday afternoon while James was in budget meetings, her fingers trembling not from her heart condition, but from the vulnerability of having to ask. Patricia and Robert Valdez had always been proud people, hardworking individuals who had built their small construction business in Tucson from nothing. They had money. Elena knew this because they had spent years telling anyone who would listen about their success, their investments, their ability to make their own financial decisions.
To provide for their daughters' futures. The conversation had started warmly enough. Patricia's voice had lit up when she heard Elena's voice, immediately launching into updates about the neighborhood, about church functions, about her sister Carmen's engagement to Bradley Whitmore, heir to a local real estate fortune. Carmen's engagement had been the family's crown jewel for months, the validation of everything Patricia had worked toward in raising her daughters to marry well and marry up. When Elena finally found the courage to explain her situation, the warmth had drained from her mother's voice like water through sand. There had been a long pause, the kind of silence that speaks volumes before any words are exchanged. Patricia had cleared her throat, and Elena could hear her father's voice in the background, though she couldn't make out the words. "Mija," Patricia had said finally, her voice carrying a weight that Elena had never heard before. "You know we would do anything for you, but the timing. Carmen's wedding is in 6 weeks. We've already put down deposits for everything. The venue at the Ritz-Carlton, the flowers, the photographer, the dress alterations. Bradley's family is expecting perfection, and you know how important this connection is for our family's future." Elena had felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she had pressed on. She explained that Dr. Torres had a cancellation and could potentially move her surgery up if the financial arrangements were made immediately. She explained that waiting another 2 months could mean the difference between a successful intervention and irreversible damage. She explained that she wasn't asking for a gift. She and James would pay back every penny with interest, but Patricia had been unmoved. "Elena, you married a governor. Surely he has resources we don't have. You chose your life and we supported that choice, but we can't sacrifice Carmen's future for a medical procedure that may not even be necessary." May not even be necessary. The words had echoed in Elena's mind long after she hung up the phone. Her own mother had questioned the urgency of her life-saving surgery, had reduced her medical crisis to an inconvenient request that threatened the social climbing aspirations of the family. The rejection had been devastating enough, but what came next had been like a blade to the heart that was already struggling to keep her alive. 2 days later, Elena had received a text message from Carmen. Not a call, not even a personal message, but a group text sent to extended family and friends. The message contained photos from Carmen's bridal shower, an event Elena hadn't even known was happening. The images showed an elaborate celebration at the country club, with Patricia beaming beside Carmen as she opened gift after expensive gift. One photo had made Elena's breath catch in her throat. It showed Patricia holding up a check. A wedding gift from the parents to the bride and groom. Elena had to zoom in to read the amount clearly, and when she did, her phone had slipped from her trembling hands. $50,000. Her parents had presented Carmen with a wedding gift that exceeded the amount Elena needed for her surgery by $3,000. James had found her that evening, sitting in their bedroom, still staring at the photo on her phone screen. He had taken one look at her face and known immediately that something had shattered. Elena had shown him the message, had explained the conversation with her mother, had watched as her husband's expression shifted from concern to disbelief to a cold fury she had rarely seen in their 5 years of marriage. "They chose a party over your life," James had said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the implications completely. They had the money. They made a choice. Elena had tried to defend them initially, making excuses about timing and family obligations and the pressure of social expectations, but even as the words left her mouth, she could hear how hollow they sounded. Her parents had chosen Carmen's wedding over
Elena's surgery. They had chosen appearances over their daughter's survival. They had chosen to fund a single day of celebration rather than ensure Elena would be alive to see many more days. The next morning, Elena had woken to the sound of James on the phone in his study, his voice sharp and businesslike. She had assumed he was dealing with state business until she caught fragments of the conversation, words like medical loan, emergency procedures, and immediate approval. When she finally went to find him, she discovered that her husband had spent the night calling in every favor, leveraging every relationship, and restructuring their finances to make her surgery possible without her parents' help. Dr. Torres had agreed to perform the surgery the following week, and James had arranged for a medical loan through a program designed specifically for government employees facing health crises. The paperwork had been expedited, the financial arrangements made, and Elena's surgery scheduled for the Tuesday before Carmen's wedding weekend. But the damage to Elena's relationship with her family had been done. The knowledge that her parents valued her sister's social event more than her life had created a wound that no surgical procedure could repair. Elena had tried to move forward, tried to focus on her recovery and her gratitude for James's unwavering support. She had told herself that what mattered was that she was getting the treatment she needed, that her husband had moved heaven and earth to make it happen. However, 3 days before her scheduled surgery, Elena's carefully constructed peace had crumbled completely. She had been resting in the mansion's sunroom, reading through well wishes from James's staff and political colleagues, when her phone had buzzed with an incoming call. Carmen's name appeared on the screen, and despite everything,
Elena had felt a flutter of hope that her sister was calling to check on her, to offer support, to bridge the gap that their parents' decision had created. Instead, Carmen's voice had been sharp with accusation and frustration. Elena, you need to talk to your husband. Bradley's family is asking questions about why our parents seem stressed and distracted. Mom's been crying at every wedding planning meeting, and Dad's been short with everyone. This is supposed to be the happiest time of my life, and you're ruining it with your drama. Elena had been so stunned by her sister's words that she had initially been unable to respond. Carmen had continued, her voice growing more agitated with each sentence. I know you think your surgery is some kind of emergency, but people have medical procedures all the time. You could have scheduled this for after my wedding. 3 weeks wouldn't have made that much difference. Carmen, Elena had managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, my heart is failing. Dr. Torres says that waiting could mean permanent damage or worse. Doctors always say things like that to scare people into paying more money, Carmen had replied dismissively. Besides, if it was really that serious, wouldn't you be in the hospital right now instead of sitting at home talking on the phone?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Had expected. You want me to postpone life-saving surgery so that your in-laws won't think less of our parents? I want you to stop being selfish, Carmen had snapped. This wedding represents everything our family has worked toward. Bradley's connections could change our parents' entire future, could set them up for retirement, could open doors none of us ever dreamed of. And you want to jeopardize all of that because you can't wait 3 more weeks for an elective procedure? Elective procedure. Elena had ended the call without another word, her hands shaking as she set the phone aside. Her own sister had just called her life-saving heart surgery an elective procedure. Her own sister had just called her selfish for refusing to risk her life for the sake of wedding optics. James had found her an hour later, still sitting in the sunroom, but now staring blankly at the garden beyond the windows. When she had recounted Carmen's call, Elena had watched her husband's expression shift through several emotions before settling on something she had never seen before, a cold, calculating anger that spoke of decisions being made and consequences being weighed. They don't get to do this to you, James had said finally, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that Elena recognized from his most serious political moments. They don't get to abandon you when you need them most and then demand that you sacrifice your health for their social aspirations. Elena had tried to argue that maybe Carmen was right, that maybe 3 weeks wouldn't make a significant difference, that maybe preserving family relationships was worth the risk. But even as she spoke the words, she could see James's expression hardening. Elena, he had said, taking her hands in his, if the situation were reversed, if Carmen needed life-saving surgery and it conflicted with some event in our lives, what would you do? The answer had been immediate and obvious. Elena would have moved mountains, canceled everything, liquidated every asset to ensure Carmen got the medical care she needed. She would have done it without question, without resentment, without making Carmen feel guilty for having a medical emergency at an inconvenient time. That realization had been the final crack in the foundation of Elena's relationship with her family. They weren't just failing to support her, they were actively asking her to risk her life for their convenience. They weren't just prioritizing Carmen's wedding, they were treating Elena's survival as negotiable, as something that could be rescheduled around social events. The surgery had proceeded as planned the following Tuesday. Elena had gone into the operating room with James's hand in hers and his promise that whatever happened next, she would never again have to question whether she was valued and loved. The procedure had been successful, Dr. Torres emerging 6 hours later with a smile and reassurances that Elena's heart would be stronger than it had been in years. But as Elena had been recovering in the cardiac ICU, her phone had buzzed with message after message from her family. Not messages of concern or relief about her surgery, but messages of anger and accusation about the disruption her medical crisis had caused to Carmen's wedding preparations.
Patricia had sent a long text detailing how Elena's selfishness had ruined Carmen's bridal week, how the stress of Elena's drama had caused Patricia to be unable to enjoy the pre-wedding festivities. Carmen had sent photos from her bachelorette party with a caption that read, "Some people know how to support family during important moments. Others create unnecessary drama and stress. Grateful for the people who truly love me." Elena had stared at that message for a long time. Her heart, her surgically repaired, medically sound heart, breaking in ways that Dr. Torres could never fix. Her sister had used Elena's life-saving heart surgery as an opportunity to play victim, to paint herself as the wronged party, to suggest that Elena's medical crisis had been a deliberate attempt to sabotage Carmen's happiness.
Meetings with legislative leaders when Elena had received those messages, but when he had returned to the hospital that evening and seen her face, he had immediately known that something beyond her surgery had wounded her. Elena had shown him the messages, had watched as her husband read each cruel word, had seen his jaw tighten with each dismissive phrase. "This ends now," James had said, his voice carrying a finality that Elena had learned to recognize over their years together. "They don't get to hurt you like this. They don't get to treat your life as disposable and then make you feel guilty for surviving." Elena had tried to protest, had suggested that maybe after the wedding things would calm down, that maybe her family would come to understand the severity of her condition and regret their words. But James had been unmoved. "Elena, they know exactly how serious your surgery was. They chose not to care. They chose to prioritize a party over your life, and now they're punishing you for refusing to die quietly on their timeline." The words had been harsh, but Elena had recognized the truth in them. Her family hadn't misunderstood her medical situation, they had simply decided that it was less important than their social ambitions. They hadn't failed to support her out of ignorance or confusion, they had deliberately chosen to abandon her when she needed them most. As Elena had drifted off to sleep that night in her hospital bed, her heart beating strong and steady for the first time in months, she had no idea that James was already making phone calls, already putting in motion a series of events that would ensure her family understood exactly what their choices had cost them. She had no idea that her husband's connections in state government, federal agencies, and regulatory bodies were about to take a very close look at Robert Valdez's construction business and its compliance with various codes, regulations, and tax obligations. Elena had no idea that her family's decision to value appearances over her life was about to have consequences that would reverberate through every aspect of their carefully constructed social climbing ambitions. Because while Patricia and Robert Valdez had been busy planning the perfect wedding for their younger daughter, they had forgotten that their older daughter was married to a man who understood that justice sometimes required more than just personal forgiveness. The wedding had gone forward as planned that Saturday. Elena had been home recovering, still weak from surgery but surrounded by friends and colleagues from James's administration who had stepped in to provide the support her biological family had refused to offer. She had received dozens of flowers, cards, and visits from people who barely knew her personally, but who understood that when someone in their community was in crisis, you showed up. Meanwhile, 2 states away, Carmen had walked down the aisle in her designer gown. Patricia and Robert had smiled for the cameras with Bradley's wealthy family, and everyone had celebrated the union that represented their family's arrival into Tucson's social elite. What none of them had realized was that their celebration was about to be short-lived. Because sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty isn't immediate revenge, it's the patient, methodical application of consequences that had been building from the moment they chose appearances over love. Elena's recovery from surgery had been complicated, not by medical issues, but by the emotional trauma of realizing that the people she had loved most in the world were capable of such calculated cruelty. Dr. Torres had warned her that emotional stress could impact her heart's healing process, and Elena had struggled with anxiety and depression as she processed the reality that her family had essentially written her off. James had been her anchor during those dark weeks, never once suggesting that she should forgive or move on or give her family another chance.
Instead, he had validated her pain, had assured her that her hurt and anger were not only justified, but necessary for her own healing. He had surrounded her with people who understood that love didn't come with conditions, that family wasn't just about blood relations, but about who showed up when life became difficult. 3 weeks after Elena's surgery, as she was finally beginning to feel physically strong enough to resume some of her normal activities, Carmen and Bradley had returned from their honeymoon in Italy. Elena had expected some kind of outreach, perhaps an apology, or at least an acknowledgement that the conflict during Elena's medical crisis had been unfortunate. Instead, she had received a call from Carmen that had made it clear her sister viewed Elena's survival and recovery as a continuing inconvenience rather than a reason for gratitude or reconciliation. "Elena, we need to talk about Mom and Dad," Carmen had said, without any greeting or inquiry about Elena's health. "They've been getting some kind of harassment from government inspectors, and Bradley thinks it might be connected to James's political position." Elena had been confused initially, having no knowledge of any inspections or government involvement with her parents' business. What kind of harassment? Building inspectors, tax auditors, environmental compliance people, they've been showing up at the construction sites almost daily for the past 2 weeks. Dad's projects are getting delayed, clients are getting nervous, and it's costing them a fortune in overtime and legal fees. Elena had felt a chill of recognition, though she had tried to dismiss it as paranoia. "Carmen, if they're being inspected, there's probably a legitimate reason. Government agencies don't just randomly target businesses." "Don't be naive," Carmen had snapped. "We both know your husband has connections everywhere. This started right after the wedding, right after our conversation about your surgery. It's too coincidental to be random." Elena had ended that call feeling deeply unsettled, not because she thought James was incapable of using his position to protect her, but because she realized she hoped he was doing exactly that. The thought should have troubled her more than it did. But after weeks of processing her family's abandonment, Elena had discovered that her capacity for protecting people who had refused to protect her had been fundamentally altered. That evening, when James had returned from the State House, Elena had asked him directly whether he knew anything about the inspections of her parents' business. Her husband had looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before responding, "Elena, your father's construction company has been operating for 15 years without a comprehensive audit of their compliance with state and federal regulations. Given the size and scope of their contracts, particularly the public works projects they've been awarded, a thorough review is not only appropriate, it's overdue." The careful political phrasing of his response had told Elena everything she needed to know. James hadn't ordered harassment or persecution. He had simply ensured that Robert Valdez's business received the same level of scrutiny that any company of its size should expect. If her father's business practices were legitimate and compliant, the inspections would ultimately clear them. If they weren't, then the consequences would be the natural result of their own choices. "And if they find problems?" Elena had asked. "Then your parents will face the same legal and financial consequences that any business owner faces when they cut corners or ignore regulations," James had replied. "Their treatment of you doesn't make them immune to accountability for their business practices." Elena had understood then that this wasn't about revenge. It was about removing the protective privileges that her parents had enjoyed as a result of their connection to James's administration. For years, Robert Valdez had benefited from having a governor for a son-in-law, receiving preferential consideration for state contracts, and a level of regulatory flexibility that other contractors didn't enjoy. James was simply withdrawing those informal benefits.
Protections, and ensuring that her parents' business faced the same oversight as everyone else's. The realization had been both sobering and liberating. Elena's parents had traded away their relationship with her for Carmen's wedding and their social ambitions. Now they were discovering that their connection to political power had also been dependent on their treatment of the person who had provided that connection. As the weeks had passed, Elena had learned more about the scope of what the inspections were uncovering. Robert Valdez's construction company had been cutting corners on safety regulations, had been misrepresenting the qualifications of some subcontractors, and had been claiming tax benefits they weren't entitled to receive. None of these violations were severe enough to result in criminal charges, but they were significant enough to result in substantial fines, project delays, and the loss of several lucrative contracts. More importantly, the scrutiny had revealed that Patricia and Robert had been inflating their wealth and success for years. The lavish lifestyle they had used to justify denying Elena help with her surgery had been largely financed through questionable business practices and creative accounting. Their ability to spend $50,000 on Carmen's wedding had come at the cost of regulatory compliance and tax obligations that were now coming due with interest and penalties. Elena had felt no satisfaction in learning about her parents' financial troubles, but she had felt a deep sense of validation. Their decision to prioritize appearances over her life had been based on a foundation that was itself built on appearances rather than substance. They had sacrificed their relationship with their daughter to protect wealth and status that had been largely illusory. The final blow had come 6 weeks after Elena's surgery, when Bradley Whitmore's family had quietly canceled several business deals with Robert Valdez's company. The regulatory scrutiny and compliance issues had made her father's business a liability that the Whitmores couldn't afford to be associated with. The very social connections that Patricia and Robert had prioritized over Elena's life were now distancing themselves from the Valdez family to protect their own reputations. Carmen had called Elena in tears, begging her to ask James to call off the investigations, to use his influence to make the problems go away. She had accused Elena of being vindictive, of punishing the entire family for a simple disagreement about timing and priorities. "This isn't about disagreement, Carmen," Elena had said quietly. "This is about consequences. You all decided that my life was less valuable than your social ambitions. Now you're learning what it costs to make that choice." "But we're family," Carmen had pleaded. "Families forgive each other. Families move past conflicts." "Families also support each other during medical emergencies," Elena had replied. "Families don't ask their daughters to risk death for wedding optics. You taught me that blood relation doesn't guarantee love or loyalty. I'm just applying that lesson." Elena had hung up that call feeling something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of peace that came from finally understanding her own worth. Her parents had shown her that their love was conditional, that their support came with terms and limitations. In response, James had shown them that their access to the benefits of being connected to his administration was equally conditional. The symmetry wasn't lost on Elena. Her family had valued appearances over substance, social connections over genuine relationships, and they were now facing the consequences of building their lives on such unstable foundations. Meanwhile, Elena's heart was beating strong and steady, surrounded by people who had proven that real family wasn't about shared genetics, but about shared commitment to each other's well-being. As Elena sat in the mansion's sunroom on a crisp October morning, 6 months after her surgery and 3 months after Carmen's wedding, she reflected on how much had changed in such short time. Her relationship with her biological family was effectively over, but her understanding of what family actually meant had been clarified in ways she never could have anticipated. James had never explicitly told her about the role he had played in her parents' business troubles, and Elena had never directly asked for details. Some conversations didn't need to happen, because the understanding between them was deeper than words. Her husband had used his position and influence not to seek revenge, but to ensure that her parents faced the same accountability that everyone else faced, without the special considerations they had enjoyed as a result of their connection to him. The message had been clear.
If you're going to treat the governor's wife as expendable, you're going to be treated like everyone else rather than receiving the preferential treatment that comes with being the governor's in-laws. If you're going to prioritize appearances over substance, you're going to face the scrutiny that reveals when your own success is more about appearance than substance. Alitsna's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced down to see James's name on the screen. He was in budget meetings all morning, but he had sent her a simple message. "Lunch together? I have news that might interest you." Elena smiled as she typed back her agreement. She had learned over the past months that when James said he had interesting news, it usually meant that justice was continuing to unfold in ways that most people never saw coming. Her husband understood that the most powerful responses to cruelty weren't dramatic confrontations or public embarrassments. They were the quiet, systematic application of consequences that gradually revealed the true cost of treating people as disposable. As Elena prepared to meet James for lunch, she had no idea that the news he wanted to share would involve federal agencies, tax investigations, and consequences that would extend far beyond anything her family had yet experienced. She had no idea that their decision to abandon her during her medical crisis was about to cost them everything they had thought they were protecting. Because while Patricia and Robert Valdez had been focused on recovering from the state-level investigations and trying to rebuild their business reputation, they had forgotten that governors have connections that extend well beyond state boundaries. They had forgotten that when you hurt someone with federal-level relationships, the scope of potential consequences expands exponentially. Elena's story was far from over. In fact, as she walked toward James's office for their lunch meeting, she was about to learn that everything her family had experienced so far had been merely the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The real consequences of their choice to value appearances over her life were about to unfold on a scale that would make their previous troubles seem minor in comparison. But Elena no longer felt anxiety about what was coming next. Her heart was strong, her marriage was solid, and her understanding of her own worth had been forged in the crucible of abandonment and betrayal. Whatever James had to tell her, whatever was about to happen to the people who had treated her life as negotiable, Elena was ready to face it with the confidence that came from finally understanding the difference between being loved conditionally and being loved completely. The sunroom door closed behind her with a soft click, and Elena Martinez Richardson walked toward her future, knowing that she would never again question whether she deserved to be prioritized by the people who claimed to love her. Because she had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can receive is the clarity that comes when people show you exactly how little they value you. That clarity had cost her a family, but it had given her something far more valuable, the unshakable knowledge of her own worth and the ironclad certainty that she would never settle for conditional love again. Elena arrived at James's private office to find him standing by the window that overlooked the Capitol grounds, his posture rigid with the kind of tension she had learned to recognize over their years together. When he turned to greet her, his expression carried a gravity that made her stomach tighten despite her improved health. "Sit down," he said gently, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged around his desk. "What I'm about to show you is going to be difficult, but you need to see it before anyone else contacts you about it." James opened a thick manila folder and withdrew several documents, each bearing official seals and letterheads that Elena didn't immediately recognize. As he arranged them on the desk between them, she caught glimpses of phrases like Internal Revenue Service, Department of Labor, and Federal Bureau of Investigation. 3 days ago, I received a call from Director Michelle Santos at the FBI's Denver field office, James began, his voice measured and professional. "It seems that the state-level inspections of your father's business triggered some automated cross-referencing in federal databases. When companies under regulatory scrutiny are connected to political figures, additional protocols get activated." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. Connected to political figures? "You're my wife. That makes your immediate family subject to higher levels of scrutiny regarding potential conflicts of interest, influence peddling, and financial improprieties. It's standard protocol, Elena. What's not standard is what they found." James slid the first document across the desk. Elena recognized it as a tax return, but the numbers and calculations were far more complex than anything she had ever seen before.
Her father's construction company appeared to have multiple subsidiaries, partnerships, and financial arrangements that created a web of transactions she couldn't begin to follow. Your father has been running what federal investigators are calling a sophisticated tax evasion scheme, James explained, his finger tracing certain highlighted sections. He's been creating shell companies, inflating expenses, hiding income through multiple business entities, and claiming deductions for personal expenses. The IRS estimates he's avoided paying approximately $230,000 in federal taxes over the past 5 years. The number hit Elena like a physical blow. Her parents had refused to help with her $47,000 surgery while owing nearly $250,000 to the federal government. They had claimed they couldn't afford to help save her life while actively stealing from taxpayers through fraudulent business practices. There's more, James continued, producing another set of documents. The Department of Labor investigation revealed that your father has been systematically underpaying his workers and misclassifying employees as independent contractors to avoid paying benefits and payroll taxes. They've identified at least 67 workers who were denied proper compensation over the past 3 years. Elena stared at the documentation, her mind struggling to process the scope of what her father had been doing. The man who had raised her to believe in hard work and honest living had been building his wealth by cheating the government and exploiting his workers. The success that Patricia had been so proud of, the financial security that they had used to justify abandoning Elena during her medical crisis, had been built on fraud and theft. The federal investigation also uncovered something else, James said, his voice growing even more serious. Your parents have been using Carmen's engagement and wedding as part of an elaborate money laundering operation. James produced photographs that appeared to have been taken with surveillance equipment. Elena could see images of her parents meeting with Bradley Whitmore's father at various locations, exchanging briefcases and documents. Other photos showed Robert Valdez at construction sites with men Elena didn't recognize but who were identified in the accompanying reports as known associates of organized crime families. The Whitmore family isn't just wealthy, Elena. They're connected to some very dangerous people who need legitimate businesses to clean their money. Your father's construction company has been accepting contracts funded with illegal proceeds, then using those projects to generate clean income that gets distributed through various shell companies. Elena felt sick as the implications became clear. Carmen's perfect wedding hadn't just been funded by tax evasion and worker exploitation. It had been part of a criminal enterprise that put their entire family at risk. The social connections that Patricia had been so desperate to secure were actually relationships with people involved in organized crime. "How long have you known about this?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The initial reports came back 2 weeks ago, but I wanted the investigators to be absolutely certain before I shared any of this with you. Elena, your parents aren't just facing civil penalties for tax evasion. They're looking at federal criminal charges for money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy." James opened another folder and showed Elena surveillance photos taken at Carmen's wedding. Several of the guests had been identified as persons of interest in ongoing federal investigations into organized crime activities. The celebration that her family had prioritized over her life had actually been a gathering of criminals and their associates. "Carmen and Bradley?" Elena asked, dreading the answer. "Carmen appears to have been unaware of the criminal aspects, but Bradley has been actively involved in coordinating the money laundering operations. His arrest is expected within the next 48 hours. Carmen will likely be questioned extensively, but unless they find evidence of her direct involvement, she probably won't face charges." Elena leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what James was revealing. Her parents hadn't just abandoned her for social ambitions, they had abandoned her to protect a criminal enterprise. They hadn't chosen Carmen's wedding over Elena's surgery out of family priorities. They had chosen crime profits over their daughter's life. "There's something else you need to know," James continued, producing one final document. "The federal investigation revealed that your parents have been monitoring our financial situation through illegal access to banking records. They knew exactly how much money we had available for your surgery. They knew we were liquidating investments and taking loans to cover your medical expenses. The document showed
detailed records of unauthorized access to Elena and James's bank accounts, investment portfolios, and even James's government salary information. Patricia and Robert had been tracking their daughter's financial desperation while simultaneously refusing to help and lying about their own financial capacity. They watched us struggle to find the money for your surgery while they had hundreds of thousands of dollars hidden in offshore accounts, James said, his voice tight with controlled anger. They let you believe they couldn't afford to help while they were living off criminal proceeds that could have paid for your surgery 20 times over. Elena stared at the banking records, seeing clear evidence that her parents had been accessing her personal financial information throughout her medical crisis. They had known exactly how difficult it was for James to arrange the funding for her surgery. They had watched her husband scramble to liquidate assets and secure emergency loans while they had been sitting on vast amounts of illegally obtained money. They could have saved my life without even dipping into their legitimate assets, Elena said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. They had criminal money that they were already hiding from taxes. They could have helped me without any risk to themselves or impact on Carmen's wedding. That's correct, James confirmed. The money they gave Carmen as a wedding gift came from one of the offshore
accounts. They literally chose to give her illegal proceeds rather than use any portion of those funds to ensure your survival. Elena felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about family priorities or poor timing or social pressures. Her parents had actively chosen to let her risk death while sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden assets. They had made a calculated decision that their criminal activities were more important than their daughter's life. James moved around the desk and knelt beside Elena's chair, taking her hands in his. Elena, I need you to understand something. When I initiated the state-level investigations into your father's business, I had no knowledge of any federal crimes. I was simply removing the preferential treatment he had been receiving as my father-in-law. Everything else, all of these discoveries, they're the result of your parents' own choices and actions. Elena nodded, understanding what James was telling her. He hadn't orchestrated their downfall. He had simply removed their protection from scrutiny. The criminal enterprise, the tax evasion, the money laundering, the exploitation of workers, all of that had been Robert and Patricia's doing. James had just ensured that they faced the same oversight as everyone else. What happens now? Elena asked. Federal agents will be executing search warrants on their property, their business, and their bank accounts tomorrow morning. Robert and Patricia will be arrested and charged with multiple federal crimes. The IRS will be seizing assets to recover unpaid taxes and penalties. The Department of Labor will be pursuing restitution for all the workers who were cheated out of proper wages. James pulled out one more document, this one bearing the seal of the United States Attorney's Office. There's also this. Because your parents used their relationship to me to gain credibility with potential criminal partners, and because they exploited that connection to avoid scrutiny that might have uncovered their crimes earlier, they're facing additional charges for abuse of public trust and corruption. Elena read through the charges list, her eyes widening as she took in the scope of what her parents were facing. Money laundering, tax evasion, wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, corruption. Each charge carried potential prison sentences that could add up to decades behind bars. They're going to prison, Elena said, the statement more factual than emotional. Unless they cooperate fully with federal investigators and provide evidence against their criminal associates, yes, they're looking at significant prison time, James confirmed. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you prepared for what's going to happen when this becomes public? Elena considered the question carefully. Tomorrow, the news would break that the parents of the governor's wife had been arrested for federal crimes. The media attention would be intense and invasive. Her family's betrayal during her medical crisis would likely become public knowledge. Carmen's marriage would be destroyed when Bradley was arrested. The entire social structure that Patricia had worked so hard to build would collapse in spectacular fashion. Will they try to blame you? Elena asked. Will they claim this is political persecution? James nodded grimly. They'll almost certainly try to frame this as revenge for their refusal to help with your surgery. Their attorneys will probably argue that I used my position to target them unfairly.
The media will want to explore the family dynamics and the timing of everything. Elena thought about Patricia and Robert sitting in their Tucson home, probably planning how to rebuild their business relationships and recover from the state-level investigations, completely unaware that federal agents were preparing to arrest them within hours. They had spent months treating her medical crisis as an inconvenience while building their wealth through criminal activities. "Let them try to blame you," Elena said finally, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Let them try to explain to the public why they chose crime over their daughter's life. Let them try to justify stealing from taxpayers while refusing to help pay for life-saving surgery. Let them try to make themselves the victims in this story." James studied her face carefully. "You're not going to try to protect them? You're not going to ask me to intervene on their behalf?" Elena shook her head without hesitation. "They made their choices, James. They chose crime over honesty, money over family, appearances over substance. They chose to let me risk death rather than dip into their illegal assets. They don't get to escape the consequences of those choices just because I survived despite their abandonment." James squeezed her hands gently. "There's one more thing. The federal investigators want to interview you about your knowledge of your parents' business practices and financial situation. They need to establish that you had no awareness of the criminal activities and no involvement in any of the financial schemes." "When?" Elena asked. "Next week, after the arrests and initial hearings. It will be routine questions, mostly to clear you of any suspicion and to document the timeline of your medical crisis and their refusal to help. Your testimony about their claimed inability to afford your surgery will be important evidence of their deception about their true financial situation." Elena nodded, feeling a strange sense of clarity about what was coming. She would tell the truth about everything, about their refusal to help, about their claim that they couldn't afford her surgery, about their decision to fund Carmen's wedding instead. The truth would speak for itself. "I have one question," Elena said. "Did you know this would happen? When you removed their preferential treatment, did you suspect it would lead to federal investigations?" James was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "I knew that your father's business practices were probably not completely legitimate. Men don't build that kind of wealth that quickly in construction without cutting corners somewhere. But I had no idea about the scope of what investigators would find. I certainly had no knowledge of organized crime connections or money laundering operations." "But you're not surprised?" Elena observed. "No," James admitted. "I'm not surprised. People who are capable of abandoning their daughter during a life-threatening medical crisis are usually capable of other forms of moral compromise. The same character flaws that let them prioritize money over your life also let them prioritize easy profits over honest business practices." Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Capitol grounds where protesters and supporters regularly gathered to make their voices heard. She thought about all the times her father had lectured her about hard work and integrity, all the times her mother had praised the values they had instilled in their daughters. The hypocrisy was staggering. "They taught me that family comes first," Elena said, without turning around. "They taught me that you support the people you love no matter what. They taught me about loyalty and sacrifice and putting others before yourself." She turned back to face James, her expression calm but determined. "Then they showed me that everything they taught me was a lie. They showed me that their values were just words they used to control me while they lived by completely different principles." James joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What they taught you wasn't wrong, Elena. The problem is that they never believed any of it themselves. They used those values to manipulate you into being the kind of daughter they wanted, while they secretly lived as criminals and hypocrites." Elena leaned back against her husband's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her shoulder blades. Her own heart, surgically repaired and stronger than ever, beat in synchronization with his. The contrast wasn't lost on her. While her parents had been destroying themselves through criminal choices, James had literally helped save her life and then protected her from people who treated her as
Expendable. "Tomorrow changes everything," Elena said softly.
Tomorrow reveals what was always true, James corrected. Your parents have been criminals and hypocrites for years. Tomorrow just makes it public knowledge. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced down to see Carmen's name on the screen. The message was brief but desperate. Elena, I need to talk to you. Something's happening with Bradley's family. They're acting strange and won't explain why. Can you call me? Elena showed the message to James, who read it with a grim expression. Bradley's family probably knows his arrest is imminent. They're likely trying to distance themselves and protect their assets before the federal charges become public. Should I call her? Elena asked. That's your choice, James replied. But remember that anything you say to Carmen might be shared with Bradley, and anything you share with Bradley might end up in the hands of federal investigators or defense attorneys. If you do talk to her, don't discuss what we've learned today. Elena stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about her sister's situation. Carmen was about to discover that her fairy tale marriage was built on criminal foundations, that her perfect husband was involved in money laundering operations, that her parents were career criminals who had funded her wedding with stolen money. The next few days would shatter every assumption Carmen had about her life and her family. But Elena also remembered Carmen's words during her medical crisis, her dismissal of Elena's surgery as elective, her resentment that Elena's life-threatening condition had interfered with wedding preparations. She remembered Carmen's accusation that Elena was being selfish for refusing to risk death for the sake of wedding optics. Elena deleted the message without responding. I can't save her from this, Elena told James. She chose to prioritize appearances over substance, just like our parents did. She chose to value social connections over family relationships. Now she gets to learn what those choices actually cost. James nodded approvingly. Carmen is an adult who made her own decisions about what mattered to her. You're not responsible for protecting her from the consequences of marrying into a criminal family or for shielding her from the truth about your parents. Elena's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Patricia. Elena looked at the caller ID for several seconds before declining the call and blocking the number entirely. Whatever her mother wanted to say, whatever explanation or manipulation or guilt trip she was preparing to deliver, Elena didn't need to hear it. I want to be there tomorrow, Elena said suddenly. When they're arrested, I want to see it happen. James looked surprised. Elena, that's not necessary. The media attention will be intense, and seeing your parents taken into custody might be more traumatic than you expect. I need to see it, Elena insisted. I need to see them face real consequences for their choices. For months, they've acted like their abandonment of me was justified, like their priorities were reasonable. I need to see them realize that actions have consequences, that treating people as disposable has costs. James studied her expression carefully, then nodded. We can arrange for you to observe from a secure location. Federal agents will be coordinating with local law enforcement, and they can ensure you have a clear view without being exposed to media cameras. Elena felt a sense of anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. She wasn't looking forward to seeing her parents suffer. She was looking forward to seeing justice finally catch up with people who had spent years believing they were above consequences. Tomorrow would mark the end of Patricia and Robert's ability to hurt people without accountability. There's one more thing we need to discuss. James returned to his desk to retrieve another folder. The federal investigators are going to recommend that you and I undergo comprehensive financial audits to ensure that none of your parents' ill-gotten assets have been converted into capital investments.
Criminal proceeds ever made their way into our accounts or investments? Elena nodded, understanding the necessity. How long will that take? Probably 6 to 8 months for a complete review. They'll examine every transaction, every gift, every financial interaction we've had with your parents since we got married. It's standard procedure when family members of public officials are involved in criminal activities. The irony wasn't lost on Elena that she and James would face months of financial scrutiny because of her parents' crimes, while those same parents had refused to help with her surgery and had illegally monitored her financial struggles. But she also understood that the audit would ultimately clear them and demonstrate that they had never benefited from Robert and Patricia's criminal activities. "Will this affect your political career?" Elena asked, the question she had been avoiding since James first showed her the federal documents. James was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "It's possible. Having in-laws arrested for federal crimes isn't ideal for any politician, but given the circumstances, their abandonment of you during your medical crisis, and the fact that we've been fully cooperative with federal investigators, I think most people will understand that we're victims of their choices, rather than accomplices." Elena felt a flash of anger at the possibility that her parents' criminal activities might damage James's career. He had spent his adult life in public service, had dedicated himself to honest governance and ethical leadership. The idea that his reputation might suffer because of Patricia and Robert's crimes was infuriating. "If it does affect your career, that's just one more thing they've stolen from us," Elena said bitterly. "They didn't just abandon me during my medical crisis, they potentially damaged your ability to serve the people who elected you." "Elena, my career will survive this," James assured her. "What matters is that you survived your surgery, and that justice is finally catching up with people who have been harming others for years. Everything else is secondary." Elena's phone buzzed with another blocked call, probably Carmen or Patricia trying to reach her from different numbers. She turned the phone off entirely, deciding that she was done being accessible to people who had proven they didn't deserve access to her life. "I keep thinking about all the workers my father cheated. All those people who trusted him to pay them fairly, who depended on those wages to support their own families. How many of them struggled to pay medical bills while he was hiding hundreds of thousands in offshore accounts?" James nodded grimly. "The Department of Labor investigation identified 67 workers who were systematically underpaid. Some of them lost their homes because they couldn't make mortgage payments on the reduced wages. Others went without medical care because they couldn't afford insurance premiums on what your father was actually paying them versus what he should have been paying them." The scope of her parents' selfishness was staggering. They hadn't just refused to help Elena, they had built their wealth by stealing from workers who were probably in situations similar to Elena's medical crisis. People who needed every dollar to survive had been cheated so that Patricia and Robert could fund Carmen's lavish wedding and their own luxurious lifestyle. "Those workers," Elena said slowly, "they're the real victims here. They're the ones who actually suffered because of my parents' greed. The restitution payments will help. Federal investigators are working to identify every worker who is cheated and calculate exactly how much they're owed in back wages and benefits. Your parents' seized assets will go toward paying those debts before anything else." Elena felt a sense of satisfaction that the money her parents had accumulated through their crimes would go to the people they had harmed rather than funding more luxury purchases or criminal activities. Justice might be slow, but it was apparently thorough.
"I want to meet with some of those workers," Elena decided. "I want to apologize on behalf of my family and make sure they know that not everyone in our family supported what was done to them." James looked concerned. "Elena, that's a generous impulse, but it might not be wise legally. Defense attorneys could try to frame any contact with victims as an attempt to influence their testimony or minimize your parents' crimes." "Then I'll wait until after the trials," Elena said, "but I want those people to know that someone in the Valdez family cares about the harm that was done to them." The afternoon sun was beginning to set outside the office windows, casting long shadows across the Capitol grounds. Elena realized that this was probably the last normal day she would have for a long time. Tomorrow, her family's criminal activities would become public knowledge, her parents would be arrested, and the media circus would begin in earnest. But Elena found herself feeling calm about what was coming. For months, she had struggled with guilt and confusion about her parents' abandonment during her medical crisis. She had wondered if she was being too harsh, too unforgiving,
too focused on her own needs rather than the family's larger concerns. Now she knew the truth. Her parents hadn't abandoned her because of competing priorities or limited resources or poor timing. They had abandoned her because they were career criminals who viewed everyone, including their own daughter, as expendable in service of their illegal enterprises. They had chosen crime profits over her life, had monitored her financial desperation while sitting on hundreds of thousands in hidden assets, had funded Carmen's wedding with stolen money while letting Elena risk death. "I need to write a statement," Elena said suddenly, "something we can release to the media tomorrow that explains my perspective on everything that's happened." James nodded approvingly. "That's smart. Getting ahead of the story will help control the narrative and make it clear that you're not trying to protect them or minimize their crimes." Elena moved to James's desk and pulled out a legal pad, her pen hovering over the blank page as she considered what she wanted to say. "How do you explain to the world that your parents chose criminal profits over your life? How do you convey the betrayal of discovering that people you trusted were capable of such calculated cruelty?" She began writing, the words flowing more easily than she had expected. By the time she finished, Elena had crafted a statement that laid out the timeline of her medical crisis, her parents' refusal to help, their claims about financial limitations, and her feelings about learning the truth of their criminal activities. James read the statement carefully, making minor suggestions for clarity and legal precision. When they finished editing, Elena had a document that presented her story honestly and completely, without sensationalizing or dramatizing the facts. It was a statement that positioned her as someone who had been harmed by her parents' choices, rather than as someone seeking revenge or trying to minimize their crimes. "This is good," James said, folding the statement and placing it in his briefcase. "It shows that you understand the seriousness of their crimes while also making clear that you were a victim of their deception and cruelty." Elena felt a sense of completion as she watched her words disappear into James's briefcase. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth about Patricia and Robert Valdez. They would know about the money laundering, the tax evasion, the worker exploitation, and the organized crime connections. They would know about the offshore accounts and the illegal monitoring of Elena's financial situation. Most importantly, they would know that Elena's parents had chosen to let their daughter risk death rather than use any portion of their criminal proceeds to ensure her survival. The court of public opinion would judge them far more harshly than Elena ever could. As Elena and James prepared to leave his office and return to the mansion,
For what would likely be their last quiet evening before the media storm began, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Genuine peace about her relationship with her biological family. She was done trying to understand their choices, done making excuses for their behavior, done hoping for reconciliation or redemption. Tomorrow would bring consequences that were years overdue. Elena intended to watch every moment of it. The morning of the arrests dawned gray and cold, with frost covering the windows of the governor's mansion like crystalline warnings of the harsh reality about to unfold. Elena had been awake since 4, not from anxiety but from a strange sense of anticipation that felt almost like excitement. Today, after months of processing betrayal and abandonment, she would finally witness accountability in action. James had arranged for her to observe the arrests from an unmarked federal surveillance van positioned 2 blocks away from her parents' Tucson home. Special Agent Michelle Santos had personally overseen the setup, ensuring that Elena would have a clear view through high-powered cameras while remaining completely hidden from media attention. The arrest warrants had been sealed until execution, so Patricia and Robert would have no warning of what was coming. At 7:30 in the morning, Elena watched through the surveillance monitor as federal agents took their positions around the house she had grown up in. The modest stucco home with its carefully maintained desert landscaping looked exactly the same as it had during her childhood, but Elena now understood that everything about her parents' life had been a carefully constructed lie. Agent Santos provided quiet commentary as the tactical team moved into position. "We've been monitoring the property since 5 this morning. Both subjects are inside, and there are no vehicles registered to known associates in the vicinity. The warrants cover the house, the detached garage workshop, 3 vehicles, and Robert Valdez's business office across town.
Elena watched her father emerge from the house in his bathrobe to retrieve the newspaper from the driveway, completely oblivious to the federal agents surrounding his property. He looked older than she remembered, his hair more gray, his movements slower. For just a moment, she felt a pang of something that might have been sadness, but it was quickly replaced by the memory of his voice telling her that Carmen's wedding was more important than Elena's surgery. At 8 o'clock precisely, Agent Santos gave the signal. Elena watched as federal agents approached the front door, search warrants in hand, while other teams simultaneously entered through the back patio and garage. The coordination was flawless and overwhelming, designed to prevent any destruction of evidence or attempt to flee. Through the surveillance equipment, Elena could see her father opening the front door, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to terror as he realized what was happening. Patricia appeared moments later, her face pale and her hands shaking as she processed the sight of federal agents filling her living room. Robert Valdez, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and racketeering. Agent Santos's voice crackled through the radio as the lead agent read the charges. Patricia Valdez, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit tax evasion, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Elena watched as her parents were handcuffed and led outside, their faces captured by the surveillance cameras in high definition. Robert's expression showed disbelief and anger, as if he couldn't comprehend that his years of criminal activity had finally caught up with him. Patricia was crying, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks as she was placed in the back of a federal vehicle. "Are they saying anything?" Elena asked Agent Santos. "Your father is demanding to speak to his attorney and insisting this is political persecution," Santos replied. "Your mother is asking if this has something to do with
James's position as governor. Neither of them has mentioned you or expressed any concern about how this might affect you." Even in the moment of their arrest, Patricia and Robert were focused entirely on themselves and their own situation. They weren't worried about Elena or concerned about how their criminal activities might impact her life and marriage. Their narcissism was so complete that they couldn't see beyond their own immediate circumstances. As the federal vehicles carrying her parents disappeared from view, Elena felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Watching them face consequences for their choices didn't bring her joy, but it brought her a deep sense of justice, finally being served. The people who had abandoned her during her medical crisis were now experiencing their own crisis, and unlike Elena, they wouldn't have family members willing to sacrifice everything to help them. The search will continue for several hours, Agent Santos informed Elena. We expect to recover computers, financial documents, communication records, and physical evidence of the money laundering operations. Everything will be processed and analyzed before the initial court hearings tomorrow. Elena nodded, understanding that this was just the beginning of a long legal process. Her parents would be arraigned, would hire attorneys, would probably try to negotiate plea deals in exchange for information about their criminal associates. The organized crime connections meant that federal prosecutors would be very interested in what Patricia and Robert could reveal about larger criminal networks. "What about Carmen and Bradley?" Elena asked. "Bradley Whitmore was arrested at his office 15 minutes ago," Santos replied. "Carmen is currently being interviewed by federal agents, but as we discussed, she doesn't appear to have been directly involved in the criminal activities. She'll likely be released after questioning, though she'll remain a person of interest during the investigation." Elena tried to imagine Carmen's shock at learning that her perfect husband was a criminal, that her lavish wedding had been funded with stolen money, that her parents were career criminals who had been lying to her for years. The fairy tale life that Carmen had been so desperate to protect was crumbling just as dramatically as Elena's had during her medical crisis. But Elena felt no satisfaction in Carmen's suffering. Her sister had been a victim of their parents' deception just as much as Elena had been, though Carmen had chosen to be complicit in Elena's abandonment during her surgery. The difference was that Elena had survived her crisis and emerged stronger, while Carmen was about to learn that her entire adult life had been built on criminal foundations.
As the surveillance van returned to Denver, Elena received a call from the media coordinator at the governor's office. News of the arrests had broken earlier than expected, and reporters were already requesting statements from Elena and James about their knowledge of the criminal activities and their reaction to the charges. "We'll be releasing your prepared statement within the hour," the coordinator informed Elena. "The governor will be holding a press conference this afternoon to address questions about the investigation and make clear that he and his administration have been fully cooperative with federal authorities." Elena spent the drive back to Denver reviewing her statement one final time, making sure every word accurately reflected her experience and her perspective on her parents' choices. She wanted the public to understand that she hadn't been protecting or enabling her parents' crimes. She had been a victim of their criminal lifestyle, just like the workers they had cheated and the taxpayers they had defrauded. The press conference that afternoon was unlike anything Elena had experienced during James's political career. The media attention was intense and invasive, with reporters asking detailed questions about Elena's medical crisis, her parents' refusal to help, and the timeline of events that had led to the federal arrests.
Investigation. James handled the questions with his characteristic calm professionalism, making clear that he had initiated state-level oversight of Robert Valdez's business practices, not as revenge, but as the removal of preferential treatment that had been inappropriate given the family conflict. He emphasized that the federal investigation had uncovered crimes that were far beyond anything he had suspected or intended to reveal. "My wife needed life-saving surgery, and her parents refused to help while claiming they couldn't afford the cost," James stated clearly. "We now know they were lying about their financial situation and were hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegally obtained assets. They chose to fund a wedding with criminal proceeds rather than save their daughter's life with legitimate resources they possessed." Elena watched from the audience as her husband presented the facts without emotion or vindictiveness, simply laying out the timeline of events and the evidence that federal investigators had uncovered. His statement made it clear that this wasn't about political power being used for personal revenge. It was about criminals finally facing consequences for choices they had made over many years. When reporters asked Elena directly about her feelings regarding her parents' arrests, she referenced her prepared statement, but added one additional comment that she hadn't planned. "My parents taught me that family means supporting each other unconditionally," Elena said, her voice steady and clear. "They taught me that love requires sacrifice and that you prioritize the people who matter most to you. Then they showed me that they never believed any of those lessons themselves. Their arrests aren't a tragedy. They're the natural consequence of people who chose crime over family, money over morality, and appearances over substance." The room fell silent as Elena's words sank in. She had just publicly stated that she felt no sympathy for her parents' situation and that she viewed their arrests as justified consequences rather than persecution. The message was clear. Elena Richardson stood with the victims of her parents' crimes, not with the criminals themselves. Over the following days, as more details of the federal investigation became public, Elena watched her parents' reputation and social standing completely collapse. The Tucson's social circles that Patricia had worked so hard to penetrate turned against them immediately, with former friends and business associates rushing to distance themselves from any connection to the criminal activities. Carmen's marriage ended within a week of Bradley's arrest, when federal investigators revealed the full scope of his involvement in money laundering operations. Carmen filed for divorce and returned to using her maiden name, though she discovered that the Valdez name was now synonymous with federal crime charges and social disgrace. Elena received several desperate phone calls from Carmen, who had apparently expected Elena to provide emotional support and possibly financial assistance during her crisis. But Elena had learned too much about conditional love and selective family loyalty to offer either. "I know you're angry about the surgery situation," Carmen had said during their final conversation, "but we're still sisters. We still have to support each other through difficult times." "No, Carmen," Elena had replied calmly, "we don't have to support each other. You taught me that when you asked me to risk death for your wedding optics. Support is something people choose to offer, not something they're automatically entitled to receive." Elena had hung up that call feeling completely at peace with her decision.
Carmen was learning what Elena had learned months earlier, that family relationships require mutual respect and genuine care, not just shared genetics and childhood memories. The federal trials began 8 months later, with Patricia and Robert facing dozens of charges that carried potential sentences of 20 to 30 years in prison. Elena attended every day of testimony, watching as prosecutors methodically presented evidence of years of criminal activity, tax evasion, and worker exploitation. The most damaging evidence came from Robert's own financial records, which showed detailed accounting of illegal proceeds alongside personal expenses like Carmen's wedding costs and luxury purchases. Federal investigators had traced every dollar, making it impossible for the defense to claim ignorance or mistake. Elena's testimony was brief but devastating. She described her medical crisis, her parents' refusal to help, their claims about financial limitations, and her subsequent discovery that they had possessed hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden assets throughout her surgery ordeal. "Did your parents ever express any concern about your health or survival during this period?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Elena replied clearly. "Their only concerns were about wedding planning and their social obligations. They treated my medical emergency as an inconvenience that was interfering with their priorities." "And how did you feel when you learned about their true financial situation?" Elena paused for a moment, looking directly at her parents at the defense table. Patricia wouldn't meet her eyes, but Robert was staring at her with an expression of resentment that confirmed everything Elena had come to understand about his character. "I felt grateful that I had survived despite their abandonment," Elena said finally, "and I felt sorry for all the workers and taxpayers who had been cheated by her father's business practices. My parents taught me that actions have consequences, even if they apparently never believed that lesson would apply to themselves." The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Patricia and Robert were sentenced to 18 and 22 years in federal prison, respectively, with requirements to pay full restitution to victims and surrender all assets to cover unpaid taxes and penalties. Elena felt no satisfaction as she watched her parents being led away in handcuffs after sentencing. She felt justice, accountability, and closure, but not the vindictive pleasure that some people might have expected. Her parents had chosen their path years before Elena's medical crisis had forced them to reveal their true priorities. The consequences they faced were the result of their own decisions, not Elena's desire for revenge. Carmen attended the sentencing hearing but sat separately from Elena, making no attempt to reconnect or seek reconciliation. She had apparently come to understand that her parents' crimes had destroyed more than just their freedom. They had shattered any possibility of rebuilding the family relationships that their choices had damaged beyond repair. After the trials concluded, Elena threw herself into advocacy work for medical patients facing financial crises. She used her platform as the governor's wife to highlight gaps in healthcare coverage and to support legislation that would prevent families from facing impossible choices between medical care and financial survival. The work was deeply meaningful to Elena, partly because it helped other people avoid the abandonment she had experienced, but mostly because it represented a fundamental shift in her understanding of family and loyalty. Real family didn't abandon people during medical emergencies. Real family didn't choose social events over life-saving surgery. Real family didn't build wealth through criminal activities while refusing to help with legitimate medical expenses. Elena's advocacy work brought her into contact with many of the workers who had been cheated by her father's business practices. She met construction workers who had lost homes because of unpaid wages, families who had gone without medical care because they couldn't afford insurance on their reduced income, children whose education had been disrupted because their parents couldn't pay for school expenses on the wages Robert had illegally withheld. "Your father stole 3 years of my daughter's college fund," one worker told Elena during a restitution hearing. "She had to drop out and take minimum wage jobs to help support the family. She never got to finish her degree because your father decided his criminal profits were more important than paying honest wages." Elena listened to story after story of families who had been harmed by her parents' greed and selfishness. Each account reinforced her understanding that Patricia and Robert's abandonment of her had been part of a much larger pattern of treating people as expendable in service of their own desires. The restitution payments helped some of the victims recover financially, but many of them had suffered permanent losses that could never be repaired. Children who had missed educational opportunities, families who had lost homes, workers who had been forced into bankruptcy. The human cost of her parents' crimes extended far beyond tax evasion and money laundering charges. Elena established a foundation using her inheritance from James's family to provide emergency financial assistance to families facing medical crises. The funds specifically helped people who needed immediate surgery but lacked the resources to pay upfront costs, exactly the situation Elena had faced when her parents abandoned her. "We call it the Second Chance Foundation," Elena explained to reporters at the announcement event, "because everyone deserves a second chance at life, even when the people who are supposed to love them unconditionally choose not to provide that chance." The foundation's first recipient was a single mother whose child needed heart surgery similar to Elena's procedure. The woman had been working 3 jobs to save money for the operation, while her daughter's condition deteriorated, facing the same impossible choice between waiting for financial resources and risking permanent damage from delay. "I can't imagine what kind of parent would let their child suffer when they had the resources to help," the mother said when Elena presented her with a check covering the full cost of her daughter's surgery. "Thank you for making sure my daughter doesn't have to find out." Elena smiled as she watched the little girl hug her mother, understanding that this was what real family looked like. People who showed up when you needed them, people who sacrificed for your well-being, people who prioritized your survival over their convenience. It didn't require shared genetics or legal relationships. It just required choosing to love someone completely and unconditionally. 3 years after her parents' sentencing, Elena received a letter from Patricia in federal prison. The letter was long and rambling, full of self-pity and attempts to justify the choices that had led to their imprisonment. Patricia claimed that she had been a victim of Robert's criminal activities, that she had never fully understood the extent of their illegal business practices, that she regretted the timing of Elena's medical crisis and their inability to help. Elena read the letter once, then placed it in her fireplace and watched it burn to ash. Patricia was still lying, still trying to minimize her culpability, still attempting to manipulate Elena into providing sympathy and support. Even in prison, facing the consequences of her choices, Patricia couldn't bring herself to take full responsibility for the harm she had caused. Elena never responded to the letter and blocked all future correspondence from the prison. She had learned that forgiveness didn't require maintaining relationships with people who had proven themselves incapable of genuine remorse or change. Sometimes the healthiest response to toxic people was complete disconnection, regardless of family ties. James's political career had not only survived the scandal, but had been strengthened by it. Voters appreciated his transparency about the investigation and his refusal to use his position to protect criminals, even when those criminals were his wife's parents. His approval ratings actually increased during the trials as people recognized that he had chosen justice over family loyalty when the two came into conflict. Governor Richardson could have easily interfered with the investigations or provided warnings to his in-laws, one political column wrote. Instead, he demonstrated that public service means serving the public interest even when it conflicts with personal relationships. That's the kind of integrity we need more of in politics. Elena often thought about that assessment as she watched James continue his work as governor. Her husband had faced a choice between protecting criminals who had hurt his wife or ensuring with those criminals faced the same accountability as everyone else. He had chosen justice, just as Elena had chosen to prioritize her own healing over maintaining relationships with people who had abandoned her. On the 4th anniversary of her heart surgery, Elena sat in the sunroom of the governor's mansion with a cup of tea and a stack of thank you letters from families who had been helped by the Second Chance Foundation. Each letter represented someone who had received the support that Elena's parents had refused to provide, someone whose life had been saved because other people chose love over selfishness. James found her there as the sun was setting, still reading through stories of medical recoveries and family reunions made possible by strangers who cared more about human life than Elena's biological family ever had. "Any regrets?" James asked, settling into the chair beside her. Elena considered the question seriously. Her relationship with her parents was permanently over, her sister had never attempted real reconciliation, and her extended family had mostly chosen to side with Patricia and Robert despite overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Elena had essentially lost her entire biological family because she had refused to enable or forgive their abandonment of her during a medical crisis. But Elena's life was full of people who had chosen to love her unconditionally. James had moved mountains to ensure her surgery could proceed when her parents refused to help. Friends and colleagues had provided more emotional support during her recovery than her biological family had ever offered during her entire life. Strangers had sent flowers and cards when Elena's own sister had sent accusations and resentment. "No regrets," Elena said firmly. "I learned the difference between people who love you and people who claim to love you while treating you as expendable. That's the most valuable lesson anyone can learn, even if the cost is high." James nodded, understanding exactly what Elena meant. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, and some experiences were so painful that they fundamentally changed how you understood relationships and loyalty. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced down to see a photo from the latest Second Chance Foundation recipient, a teenage boy who had just received kidney surgery that his family couldn't afford. He was smiling from his hospital bed, surrounded by relatives who had clearly been crying tears of relief and gratitude. "Another successful surgery," Elena showed James the photo. "His aunt mortgaged her house to try to raise money for the procedure, and his grandfather sold his car. The whole family was contributing everything they had." "That's what real family looks like," James observed. Elena smiled, thinking about the contrast between this teenager's support system and her own experience. When Elena needed surgery, her biological family had refused to help while claiming they couldn't afford it, then used hidden criminal assets to fund a wedding celebration. When this boy needed surgery, his extended family had mortgaged their homes and sold their possessions to try to raise money for his care. The difference wasn't about financial resources. It was about values, priorities, and genuine love versus conditional affection based on convenience. Elena's heart, strong and steady after years of careful monitoring and healthy living, beat with gratitude for the hard lessons she had learned about family and loyalty. Her parents had taught her exactly what she didn't want to become, exactly what kind of person she refused to remain connected to, exactly what kind of love she would never again accept as sufficient.
Their abandonment had been devastating at the time, but it had ultimately freed Elena to build relationships based on mutual respect, genuine care, and unconditional support. She had learned to distinguish between people who showed up during crises and people who created additional crises through their selfishness and manipulation. As Elena and James watched the sunset paint the Colorado sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Elena reflected on how completely her understanding of family had been transformed. Blood relationships meant nothing without emotional commitment. Legal ties meant nothing without moral integrity. Shared history meant nothing without ongoing choice to prioritize each other's well-being. Elena had lost the family she was born into, but she had gained something far more valuable: the ability to recognize and create genuine family bonds based on love rather than obligation, choice rather than coincidence, and action rather than words. Her parents were spending their remaining years in federal prison, facing the consequences of decades of criminal choices and moral compromise. Carmen was rebuilding her life alone, apparently having learned nothing from the family's collapse about the importance of supporting people during difficult times. But Elena was surrounded by people who had chosen to love her completely, who had proven their commitment through actions rather than just words, who understood that real family meant showing up when someone needed you most rather than abandoning them for more convenient priorities. Elena Martinez Richardson had survived her medical crisis, her family's abandonment, and the discovery that the people she had trusted most were career criminals who viewed her life as expendable. She had emerged from those experiences stronger, wiser, and completely clear about what kind of relationships deserved her time and emotional investment.
The girl who had once made excuses for people who treated her as disposable had become a woman who understood her own worth and refused to accept anything less than genuine love and respect. Sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the clarity that comes when people show you exactly who they are and exactly how little they value you. Elena had received that gift from her parents, painful as it had been. In return, she had built a life filled with people who understood that love meant sacrifice, that family meant support during crises, and that real relationships required choosing each other again and again, especially when that choice became difficult or inconvenient. As the evening stars began to appear in the Colorado sky, Elena felt complete gratitude for every painful lesson that had brought her to this moment of clarity and peace. Her heart was strong, her marriage was solid, her purpose was clear, and her understanding of love was no longer clouded by the toxic example she had grown up accepting as normal. Elena had learned to love herself enough to require genuine love from others, and that knowledge had changed everything about her life for the better.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.